Hey everyone, the Rational Fareed here. Look around you. Look up at the stars tonight. Look at the sheer everything of it all. It makes you ask, doesn't it? The biggest question there is, why? Why is there anything instead of nothing? What was the actual deep down underlying reason the universe exists? Now, you hear answers. In some big belief systems, like Islam, the most common explanation, straight from Scripture, is pretty clear. You, me, all of us. We were just created to worship God, to worship Allah. Simple, right? But here's the thing, and this is where it gets really weird. They also say this same God is Al-Samad, totally and completely self-sufficient, needs absolutely nothing from anyone or anything, ever. So just think about that for a second. A being who needs nothing created an entire universe, set up this whole massive cosmic system specifically to get something? Worship? From creatures he made? Doesn't that feel like saying, I am eternally full, I require no food? And then adding, therefore, I spent billions of years creating bakeries so they could bake me cakes, which I definitely want. Like, the logic just glitches, right? If your brain just did a little bit of a record scratch there, or you've ever felt like that explanation didn't quite fully click, you are absolutely 100% not alone. It's a point of massive confusion, even within the system itself. And once you start pulling that thread, man, a whole bunch of other mind-bending questions tumble out. Like, if not for him, why create us? Why the whole intense test scenario? Why put so much emphasis on just praising the Creator? Why create this impossibly huge universe, billions of years ago, just to focus on one tiny planet and one little species that only showed up yesterday in cosmic terms? We're diving deep into all of this, unpacking the religious answers, looking at where the logic seems to tie itself in knots, and exploring why these fundamental questions remain, well, genuinely unanswered. Stick around. This gets fascinating. Alright, so let's dive into the most common, the most cited, the go-to explanation you'll encounter when you ask that big question within Islam. Why did Allah create the universe and everything in it, especially humans? The answer often points directly to the Quran, specifically verse 51, chapter 56. It's pretty direct. It states, I have not created the jinns and mankind except to worship me. Okay, there it is. Simple enough on the surface, right? The purpose of our existence, for both humans and jinns, according to this, is quite clear: to worship Allah. It sounds like the ultimate job description for conscious beings in this framework. We're here, and our role is defined: worship. But is that really the reason behind creation itself? Or is it something else entirely? So, created to worship me. Got it. But here's where we need to really slow down and think. There's a crucial difference between explaining the purpose of something once it exists and explaining the reason or motivation behind deciding to create that thing in the first place. See the difference? That verse, Quran 51:56, tells us what jinns and humans are supposed to do after they've been created. It gives us our assigned role, our task in this cosmic play. But it doesn't actually explain why the playwright decided to write the play, build the theater, and gather the actors in the first place. Think about it like this. If I build a house, and you ask me, why did you build that house? And I reply, oh, the house was built to be lived in. That tells you the function of the house now that it exists. It tells you its purpose from the perspective of the user. But it tells you absolutely nothing about my original motivation for starting that huge, expensive project of building a house when I might have been perfectly happy living somewhere else before. The worship verse defines the task after creation. It tells us what the created are meant to do. It doesn't explain the divine reason or impetus for initiating the act of creation at all. This feels less like the fundamental why behind existence, and more like the job description handed out to existence. And that, right there, is the first major disconnect. the first big unanswered layer to this question. See, when describing the nature of God, of Allah, Islamic tradition uses several attributes, and a really key one is found in Surah Al-Ikhlas, chapter 112, verse 2. This verse describes Allah as Al-Samad, and that's a heavy word. It means He is eternally self-sufficient, absolutely independent of everything. He needs nothing. He's complete, perfect, requires no sustenance, no support, no fulfillment from anywhere or anyone outside of Himself, ever. Got it? Al-Samad needs absolutely nothing. Okay, so take that attribute, needs absolutely nothing, completely independent. Now put it side by side with the idea that He created this vast, complex universe, and specifically conscious beings within it, explicitly for the purpose of worshiping Him. If He needs nothing, why create beings whose primary function is to give Him something, worship, praise, adoration? If the reason for our creation is to worship Him, doesn't that imply that He somehow benefits from or desires that worship? And if He desires it, if He wants it, doesn't that suggest a lack? A need to be adored, to be recognized, to be praised? That feels like it fundamentally contradicts the very definition of Al-Samad. It's like claiming you are the most hydrated being in existence, requiring zero water, and then saying you've built the world's biggest bottling plant so people can give you water, which you desperately want. It just doesn't logically compute. It creates this paradox, an eternally self-sufficient being who apparently created everything to satisfy a need He doesn't have. It's akin to saying, as was pointed out earlier, I am sleeping, although I don't need sleep. Why perform the action if the underlying need or desire is claimed to be non-existent? Now, realizing this potential issue, this seeming contradiction between Allah being Al-Samad, the one who needs nothing, and the statement that we were created to worship Him, Islamic scholars and preachers often step in to clarify. They'll explain that, no, you've misunderstood. Allah doesn't need our worship. He's far above that. He is Al-Samad. The verse doesn't mean He requires it for His sake. Instead, they explain, the worship, the prayers, the rituals, the striving, that's all actually for us. It's designed for the benefit of His creation. Our worship, they say, is the path to our own spiritual purification, our guidance, our way to connect with the divine, and ultimately, the means by which we earn our place in paradise. So the action of worship is commanded, yes, but the purpose of that command from this perspective is for our betterment and eternal reward, not to fulfill any lack or need on the part of the Creator. Okay, that sounds like a reasonable clarification, right? It seems to solve the Al-Samad problem by shifting the beneficiary of the worship from God to us. But does it actually answer the original question? Okay, so the explanation shifts. Worship isn't for Allah's benefit, it's for ours. It's the tool for our growth and salvation. On the surface, this seems to fix the Al-Samad contradiction. Allah isn't needing something from us for His own sake. Great. Point taken on that specific paradox. But let's zoom back out, way out. This new explanation tells us the purpose of the task. Worship is for our benefit. It tells us what happens after creation. We benefit from worship. But it still doesn't explain the most fundamental question. Why create the scenario at all? Why did the eternal, self-sufficient being who needs nothing decide at some point to create a universe containing beings who do need purification and guidance, and then institute a system of worship for those beings' benefit? If He had no need driving the initial creative act, because remember, He's Al-Samad, what was the motivation for that very first step? The worship is for our benefit explanation defines the mechanism and the outcome for the created, but it completely bypasses the impetus for the Creator to set up this entire elaborate system in the first place. It explains the function of the engine once it's running, but not why the car was built. And tied into this, it still doesn't answer the question of why the entire thing is framed as a test. If the purpose of creation is for our benefit via worship, Why is our eternal destiny contingent on passing a test that involves this worship? The counter-argument explains why we perform the tasks within the test, for our benefit, but not why the test itself was instituted, which necessitated our creation. The originating reason for the grand cosmic setup and the test within it is still stubbornly missing from the explanation. So, flowing directly from this concept of creation and our purpose within it, comes the related and also quite challenging question, why the test? Within this religious framework, life isn't just about existing and worshiping. It's consistently described as a trial, a probation, a test. The whole point of this earthly existence, we're told, is essentially to see who passes and ends up in paradise, and who fails and goes to hell. It's the ultimate pass-fail scenario. This life is presented as the arena where our deeds, our faith, our intentions are weighed, all as part of a grand test orchestrated by the Creator. It's a core piece of the puzzle. But just like the initial act of creation, when you stop and ask, well, why set up the test in the first place? The immediate answer, to pass the test, doesn't quite cut it. Alright, so the answer is created to pass the test. But here's where we run into the exact same problem we had with the created to worship explanation. Just like worship, passing the test is something you do after you already exist. It describes your function, your activity, your task as a created being. It tells us the purpose from the perspective of the created. We're here to be tested. But it completely sidesteps the question of why the Creator, an all-powerful, all-knowing being who supposedly knows the outcome of the test before it even begins, why that being decided to set up the test in the first place. An omniscient being wouldn't need a test to gain information, so the test must serve some other purpose. But what is it? We're still stuck on the initiating action. Why did the eternal, self-sufficient being decide to create the universe and us within it, for the express purpose of conducting a test? The test is the process after creation, not the reason for the creation itself. And interestingly, within the religious narrative itself, proponents often acknowledge that Allah never actually told humanity the underlying reason or motivation for instituting this test. And get this, they also admit He didn't explain why He didn't tell us the reason. It's simply presented as His will, or something beyond our comprehension. So, just like the worship answer, the created to pass the test response describes the activity after creation, but leaves the fundamental why create to test question completely hanging, with even the religious texts apparently offering no explanation for the Creator's motivation for the test itself, or for keeping that motivation a secret. So if life is a test, what exactly is the main subject? What are the key tasks? A massive part of the religious obligation, the core of the test in practice, is centered around, well, worshiping and praising Allah. We're talking things like praying 5 times a day, facing a specific direction, reciting specific verses. Now you'd think, if this life were a cosmic test for our benefit, a test designed to, say, sort the good from the bad for an afterlife, the focus would be squarely on universal ethics, right? Like, how much compassion did you show? How did you treat the vulnerable? Did you reduce suffering? Did you avoid causing harm to others? You know, a test purely based on morality towards your fellow creatures. But while those things are part of the religious path, a huge, defining, non-negotiable chunk of the test is direct ritualistic worship and praise of the being running the test. And here's where it gets even stranger. According to the texts, this constant worship and praise isn't limited to just humans and jinns taking the test. Angels apparently spend their entire eternal existence in worship, gaining no paradise from it. And it gets even bigger. Mountains, rivers, the sun, the moon, stars, animals, every single particle in the universe is supposedly incessantly worshiping and praising Allah. They aren't benefiting in the way humans supposedly do, getting to paradise. So, the scholar's explanation that worship is for our benefit totally collapses when you look at the rest of creation. It doesn't explain the mountains praising, the stars praising, the animals praising. none of whom are headed for heaven with 72 virgins. So we're right back to the paradox, but on a cosmic scale. A being who is al-Samad, who needs nothing, who is perfectly complete, presides over a universal, incessant chorus of praise and worship, from literally every single atom, none of which seems to be for the benefit of the things doing the praising. What does an infinitely powerful, infinitely perfect being gain from the forced, non-beneficial praises of a rock? If the answer is nothing, then why is this universe set up to perform it constantly? It's the ultimate example of sleeping when you don't need to sleep. And honestly, when you strip it down, doesn't a being who demands constant, universal prostration, worship, and adoration from everything he created, doesn't that sound an awful lot like, well, like the most extreme form of narcissism you can imagine? It makes you seriously consider the idea that maybe this portrayal of God, with these very specific demands for praise, isn't a reflection of ultimate reality, but rather a projection of human desires, insecurities, and, indeed, human weaknesses onto the concept of ultimate power. As the saying goes, perhaps man has created Allah in his own image, or at least with his own very human-like need for validation and praise. All right, let's step outside the theological box for a moment and just look at what we've figured out about the universe itself. Science, through mountains of evidence from cosmology and physics, tells us the universe isn't eternal in its current state. It has a beginning, roughly 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang. Okay, 13.8 billion years. Got it. Now, if you believe in an eternal, timeless God who existed forever and ever before that, why wait? Why wait for literally an eternity minus 13.8 billion years to decide to create anything? What was happening during all that infinite time before creation? Was there nothing? Was God just hanging out? Did he get bored? Need a project? A new hobby after an infinite stretch of non-creation? If you're infinite, perfect, and unchanging, what could possibly happen at the 13.8 billion years ago mark that suddenly sparks the most monumental act imaginable? And when you look at that vast timeline, we humans are incredibly, almost comically, recent additions. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, based on fossil and genetic evidence, we've only been around for maybe 300,000 years. Compare that to 13.8 billion. It's less than a blink of an eye. Meanwhile, creatures like the dinosaurs dominated the planet for over 160 million years, with the last ones dying out some 65 million years ago. Long, long before any humans showed up for their supposed test. What was the divine plan then? What was their purpose? Even the more specific religious timelines, like those suggesting Adam and Eve appeared only 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, feel incredibly short against the backdrop of Earth's own history, let alone the universe's. It makes the timing of this grand creation and test feel, well, pretty arbitrary and human-centric for an eternal, cosmic being. It begs the question, why this specific moment after an infinite wait? Look at this. This is the reality we've discovered. Our solar system is just one tiny speck. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, holds hundreds of billions of stars, many with their own planets, potentially trillions of planets out there. And the Milky Way? It's just one of billions, maybe even trillions of galaxies in the observable universe. The sheer scale, the complexity, the incredible distances involved, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Trillions upon trillions of stars, light years and light years away, many likely with worlds we can only dream of. Now, contrast this immense, awe-inspiring vast cosmos with the picture painted by the religious narrative. A narrative where the divine focus seems intensely centered on one tiny, relatively insignificant planet, Earth, and specifically on two species here, humans and jinns, and their moral choices. Even down to monitoring what individuals do in their private homes. Why create something so unbelievably big, so elaborate, so empty of any apparent relevance to the core story, if the grand drama, the test, the battle for souls is happening on just one little rock? What's the purpose of trillions of galaxies if the divine concern is primarily focused right here? This Earth-centric focus is particularly striking in prophecies, like the Islamic narratives about the end times. The Mahdi's arrival, the final battles, they all seem to take place on Earth. The narrative culminates with the heavens themselves reportedly collapsing onto Earth, destroying the entire universe along with it. If this being truly created all of that, wouldn't the divine travel methods or the descriptions of celestial beings reflect an understanding of the physics of actual space? All of this makes you wonder if this narrative wasn't conceived in a time when the cosmos was imagined as a much smaller, Earth-centered place with a solid sky right above us. The description feels limited by a pre-scientific understanding of reality. Why create such an immense, scientifically observed universe if the religious story is so narrowly focused on our tiny recent corner of it? What's the purpose of all that seemingly extra creation? We've already talked about the vastness of the universe, but what about the incredible, mind-boggling diversity of life right here on Earth? If the whole point of creation is this big test for conscious beings, what do we do with the millions, literally millions, of species of insects? Do they have a purpose in this divine plan? Are they part of the test? They don't seem to possess the kind of consciousness or moral agency that the human jinn test requires. And let's look at the deep past. What was the purpose of the dinosaurs? They roamed the Earth for over 160 million years, living and dying long before humans even registered on the planet's timeline. Were they just prologue? Set dressing for a play that hadn't even cast its main characters yet? What about our evolutionary cousins, like the Neanderthals and Denisovans? These were conscious, tool-using hominids who lived, fought, and died for hundreds of thousands of years, overlapping with or even preceding modern humans. They don't seem to fit neatly into the standard religious narrative focused on Adam and Eve as the sole, recent progenitors of humanity. What was their test? What was their purpose in a framework centered around the descendants of a single pair who came much, much later according to the scripture's timeline? The problem here, from a skeptical viewpoint, is pretty obvious. The religious texts were written by people who had no way of knowing about millions of insect species, or the millions of years dinosaurs lived, or the existence of now extinct human-like species. So, naturally, their narratives don't provide explanations for them. This life, this history, seems unaccounted for within the stated divine purpose. And while some religious texts do attribute some level of awareness to animals, like the story in the Quran where ants talk and strategize to King Solomon's army, if creatures like ants have consciousness, does that mean they are also subject to divine judgment? Do they go to heaven or hell? Is the snake that supposedly bit Abu Bakr in the cave headed for eternal damnation? It starts to feel like the framework is designed for a very specific, limited set of beings and struggles to logically incorporate the messy, complex, and ancient reality of life on Earth as we understand it today. The purpose for the vast majority of living things, especially those outside the human jinn test, remains largely unexplained within this divine narrative. So a very frequent answer you'll hear when asking about the purpose of this life is that it's all about preparing for the next one. This life is just the test, the waiting room, the farming ground where you plant the seeds that will determine your eternal destiny in either paradise or hell. The real purpose, the ultimate goal, is that eternal life to come. Okay, fair enough. This life is for that life. And here's the follow-up question that often goes unasked, or maybe just gets a vague answer. What is the purpose of that eternal life? What do you do for eternity once you've passed the test? We're often told about the rewards in paradise, eternal gardens, rivers of milk and honey, luxurious dwellings, feasting, comfort, companions. It sounds like eternal heightened material pleasure, doesn't it? And here's the potential contradiction. Often, in religious discourse about this life, things like worldly desires, material possessions, even just focusing on eating and drinking and comfort, are sometimes framed as lower pursuits, distractions, or even obstacles to true spiritual growth and the real purpose. You're encouraged to transcend materialism for a higher calling. But then, the ultimate eternal reward, the supposed pinnacle of existence, is described in terms of eternal materialism. If focusing on eating, drinking, and comfort is something you need to be careful of or rise above in this short life to gain spiritual merit, how does doing the exact same things, albeit on a grander scale, for an infinite amount of time, suddenly become the ultimate, non-materialistic purpose of eternal existence? If the purpose of this life is just to get into that life, but the purpose of that life isn't clearly defined beyond just experiencing eternal pleasure, then the answer feels circular. We've just kicked the question of purpose down the road infinitely. We haven't explained why the road exists in the first place, only that you have to travel it to get to an ultimately undefined destination of perpetual reward. If you can't explain the purpose of the infinite finish line, how can that finish line give purpose to the finite race? We're told about the purpose of our short lives and the purpose of the eternal life to come, even if we found those explanations a bit circular or contradictory. But think about the being who supposedly exists outside of all that, the being who was, is, and will be eternally, the one with infinite power, infinite knowledge, infinite existence. What is the purpose of that infinite existence? Has this eternal, self-sufficient being ever defined a purpose for himself, for his own infinite, unending existence? What exactly does an infinite, perfect consciousness do for eternity? Is the purpose of Allah's infinite life to watch over a world filled with suffering, oppression, famine, earthquakes, floods, and conflict, things that cause immense pain and death to the very creation He supposedly designed? Is His eternal purpose simply to run a test, the outcome of which He already knows, and then oversee an eternal division into punishment and reward? If this being is already complete, already perfect, already infinitely existing, what is the driving purpose for His own being? And if that ultimate, eternal purpose for the Creator is either undefined, incomprehensible to us, or seems to manifest in ways that include vast suffering and a known outcome, then how can He grant ultimate, meaningful, and comprehensible purpose to our finite, often difficult lives? It feels like if the entity dictating the purpose of everyone and everything else has no clear, compelling purpose for its own infinite existence, it undermines the very idea that it can unilaterally bestow a meaningful purpose onto others. It leaves the deepest why, the reason for any existence, including the divine, unanswered. So sometimes when you ask, why did Allah create us without asking us first? What was the driving reason? A common response you'll encounter is something like, well, your own parents didn't ask for your permission before they decided to have you, did they? The implication being, if human creators don't need permission or a deep explanation for the created, why should a divine creator? But let's think about that comparison for a second. Is that really a fair or accurate analogy? They might desire companionship, want to build a family, continue a legacy, experience the joys and challenges of raising a child, or even subconsciously seek a form of immortality or a support system in old age. These are motivations rooted in our very nature as finite, social, emotional, and biological beings. Their decision comes from a place of very real, understandable human needs and desires. But what about Allah? The religious claim is that He is Al-Samad, eternally self-sufficient, independent of all needs and desires. He lacks nothing. He is complete. If that's true, if He has no needs, no lacks, no dependencies, no desires in the way humans do, then the entire basis of the human parent analogy collapses. Human creation comes from a place of need or desire. Divine creation within this theological framework is claimed to come from a place of no need. So comparing the motivations is comparing two fundamentally different things. We can understand why human parents create life. What remains unexplained, and is precisely the core question we're asking, is why a being claimed to be without any needs would initiate creation at all. The parents didn't ask. Argument might sound clever, but it completely misses the point about the Creator's claimed nature versus the act of creation. It's a classic false analogy used to avoid addressing the actual dilemma. The final frontier of defense, when faced with these persistent why questions that don't seem to get clear answers, often boils down to this two-part idea. Firstly, Allah doesn't owe us an explanation for why He created us. And secondly, even if He did try to explain it, our limited human minds couldn't possibly comprehend His infinite wisdom and His motives anyway. Okay, let's unpack that, because from a logical and skeptical standpoint, this response feels less like an answer and more like shutting down the conversation right when it gets difficult. First off, saying Allah hasn't told us the reason, or Allah doesn't need to tell us, is fundamentally an admission. It acknowledges that the core question about the originating motivation for creation isn't actually answered within the divine communication presented. We're told what to do after creation, but the why start remains officially undisclosed. Second, the can't comprehend part. This creates a significant internal tension. Religious traditions, including Islam, often challenge humanity to use their intellect, their reason, their observation of the universe to recognize God's existence and the truth of His message. We're encouraged to think, to ponder, to seek knowledge as a way to find the divine. But then, the very same intellect that's supposed to be capable of recognizing the ultimate truth is suddenly declared incapable of grasping the most fundamental truth of all, the Creator's own reason for creating. It feels contradictory. You can't champion intellect as the tool to find God, and then declare that tool broken precisely when it asks the hardest, most foundational questions about God's actions. This conveniently places the divine motive outside the realm of rational inquiry, right at the point where the provided explanations seem inconsistent or incomplete. Ultimately, this reliance on divine mystery or incomprehensible wisdom to answer the why create question leaves a massive void. And for many skeptics and atheists, that void is far more plausibly filled by a simpler, more grounded explanation, that the religious narratives, including the Quran, were created by human beings. Perhaps Muhammad, living in the 7th century, didn't actually know the ultimate cosmic reason for creation, because no one did know back then. Science hadn't revealed the universe's age, its scale, the history of life. His answer, created for worship, was the answer available within that limited human understanding, perhaps influenced by existing cultural and religious ideas. Subsequent attempts to clarify, like worship is for our benefit, are human efforts to reconcile internal inconsistencies. But the core lack of explanation for the initiating divine motivation, the arbitrary seeming timing and scale, the contradictions, they all point back to the idea that this explanation wasn't handed down from an all-knowing cosmic being, but rather constructed from a limited human perspective. Without clear, logical, non-contradictory answers to these fundamental why questions, and without any independently verifiable evidence to back up the claim that Allah created us for X reason, the assertion that Allah created us for worship or a test or for our benefit, how is it fundamentally any different, any more substantiated, any more true than the claims of any other religion about their God's reasons for creation? From a skeptical viewpoint, they all rest on assertions that lack the compelling clarity and logical consistency expected for the most important questions about existence. So when we really peel back the layers on that seemingly straightforward answer to why creation, the idea that we were created to worship Allah, we see it leads to a series of profound and, in my view, persistently unanswered questions. We saw how that initial answer describes a task given to creation after it exists, not the reason or motivation for the Creator deciding to create in the first place. We wrestled with the core contradiction between Allah being described as Al-Samad, eternally self-sufficient and needing nothing, and yet creating beings whose primary purpose is to give Him worship and praise. we saw that even the clarification that worship is for our benefit doesn't explain why the entire system requiring that worship was set up by a being with no needs, and certainly doesn't explain the universal praise from things that don't benefit from paradise. We questioned the fundamental why test when the tester is all-knowing. We looked at the immense scale and age of the universe revealed by science and asked why an eternal being would wait billions of years and create something so vast only to focus intensely on one tiny, recent planet and its inhabitants. We considered the problem of accounting for the deep history of life, like dinosaurs and early hominids, and the vast diversity of non-conscious life, within a narrative centered on a human/jinn test, and we questioned the ultimate purpose of eternal life itself, and even the purpose of the Creator's own infinite existence. Throughout all of this, the standard religious explanations often seem insufficient, logically inconsistent, or rely on ultimately sidestepping the questions with arguments like, "Parents didn't ask." From a skeptical perspective, the cumulative weight of these fundamental unanswered questions, the internal contradictions within the theological descriptions, and the apparent mismatch between the narrative and our scientific understanding of reality, it all points to a more grounded explanation. Perhaps the reason these questions are unanswered, or the answers feel incomplete and contradictory, is because the narratives themselves weren't divine revelations of cosmic truth, but rather were the best explanations human beings, limited by their time and knowledge, could construct to grapple with the mystery of existence. The idea of a divine reason for creation might simply be beyond human reach because there wasn't one revealed, or perhaps wasn't one in the way the narrative assumes. The fundamental why behind existence remains, in this context, stubbornly unanswered in any way that satisfies logic or aligns seamlessly with our broader understanding of the universe. But that's just my perspective, looking at the arguments and the lack of clear, consistent answers. What are your thoughts? Do you find the standard explanations satisfying? Do you think there's a piece of this puzzle I've missed? Let me know everything you're thinking in the comments down below. I read as many as I can. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you're new here and want to explore more big questions from a skeptical viewpoint, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss future videos.